negotiation. The State Department says no. At that point, the New York Times had to have an article on page 22 in which there was a comment saying there are rumors that Saddam is offering negotiations, but the State Department says there's nothing to it. That took care of that. And that continued right until January when the bombing started. There's a lot of interesting things to say about this, but I'll skip it. The press wouldn't report it with that exception. Then the war came, the U.S. Bombed, and the nature of the war is illustrated by the tactics that were used. So, for example, the way when the U.S. forces invaded, one of the efficient tactics was to use bulldozers to bulldoze Iraqi conscripts from their trenches bury them under the sand. Real war. The people they buried under the sand were mostly poor Shiite and Kurdish conscripts. What there was of an army, Saddam withdrew to Baghdad because he wanted to make sure he could control the country. And then the U.S. carried out what amounted to biological warfare, bombed the energy system, the sewage systems, and so on, which is in effect biological warfare. It was devastating effects. And it was at that time that Bush proudly announced that what we say goes. After that came the sanctions. We know a lot about the sanctions. They were so horrendous that they were administered through the United Nations. So sometimes they're called UN sanctions, but everybody knew they were U.S. sanctions, U.S. British sanctions. The first couple of years, they were so destructive and murderous that something had to be done. So a kind of a humanitarian softening of the sanctions took place. That was the Oil for Food program, and that was administered by distinguished international diplomats. First, Dennis Halliday. He resigned after a couple of years, charging that they were genocidal. He now claims that maybe 1 million people were killed. He was replaced by Hans von Sponeck. He lasted about 2 years, and he resigned because he said they're violating the genocide conventions. Von Sponeck wrote a very important book about it, which was not reviewed in the United States or England, in which it's worth reading. A Different Kind of War, it's called, in which he goes through the details, describes how the Clinton administration would not permit him to present information to the Security Council about what was happening. He had plenty of information, lots of investigators running all around Iraq. In fact, he and Halliday knew more about Iraq than any Westerner, certainly. They were iced out of the American media at the time and during the build-up to the Iraq War, presumably for that reason. Not only were the sanctions essentially genocidal, but they also they devastated the society. They strengthened the dictator. They forced the population to shelter under his wings for survival, and they probably saved Saddam from being overthrown. That was the fate that happened to other comparable monsters who were supported by the U.S. and Britain right to the bitter end. Ceausescu in Romania, Suharto in Indonesia, Mobutu, Marcos, a long rogues gallery, Chun in South Korea. They were all overthrown from within, but that didn't happen in Iraq. And according to Halliday and von Sponeck, who knew the most about the situation, it was because the population was too devastated. Both of them said if you drop the sanctions, they'll probably take care of the situation themselves. But that would have meant that Iraq is run by Iraqis. And then you might get these dangerous exercises of sovereignty. Then came the war, the invasion. I don't have to say anything about that. Well, that's what we say goes. What about the not? The not is because world control is not easy, even for a state with the enormous, historically unprecedented power of the United States. By the early 1970s, with decolonization and the revival of other industrial societies after the war, the world was just getting more diverse. In fact, the UN was getting out of control. There's a very good index of this. Take a look at vetoes. We have a complete record of vetoes. From the formation of the UN up to 1965, there are no U.S. vetoes. And the UN was very popular at that time, especially in the early post-war years, because it was constantly the Russians who were vetoing. And that showed how terrible the Russians were. You know, the U.S. ran everything. You know, the UN was like completely in the hands of the United States for obvious reasons right after the war. The Russians were constantly vetoing U.S. resolutions aimed at them. If you look back, you'll find that distinguished anthropologists, British and American anthropologists and social scientists were trying to explain why the Russians say no all the time. What is it about Russian culture? I was a graduate student at the time. One of the things we liked was what we called diaperology. A couple of very distinguished figures explained, somber tones, that the Russians were so negative because they raised their infants in swaddling clothes, and that made them negative. So therefore, when Gromyko stands at the UN, he goes no all the time. Well, that was the early days of popularity of the UN, completely under the lash of the United States. By the 50s, it was already beginning to be problematic with the decolonization and the reconstruction of industrial societies. By the 1960s, the honeymoon was over. From 1965, if you look at the record of vetoes, the United States is far in the lead on all sorts of topics. Britain is second, and nobody else is within shouting distance. And the UN became very unpopular among elites. I mean, the population still supports it. We're not supposed to understand why this transition took place, but it's not that hard to figure out. By the early 1970s, the world was beginning to be what's called tripolar. Three major economic centers: North America, based in the United States, Europe, centered around mainly Germany, and a growing Asian center, which in the early 70s was Japan-centered, now much more complex. By now, there's a major Asian production center, in fact, the major production center in the world. China's kind of at the center of it, but it's worth remembering that China is basically an assembly plant for the surrounding high-tech industrial societies. So South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, they export high-tech parts and components, and in fact high technology generally, to China, and the Chinese assemble it and then export it, say, to the United States. So if you buy a Chinese-made computer, actually the technology and the sophisticated ideas and so on come from Taiwan or other surrounding areas. There's a lot of concern, as you know, about the trade deficit with China, which in fact is quite high on paper. But when you look more carefully, it turns out that it's compensated by a decline in the trade deficit to the surrounding industrial countries, which are in fact exporting to China. And then China assembles it and sends it off here. There have been a couple of studies which suggest that if the trade deficit was calculated properly, the deficit to China would go down by about 30%, maybe 25, 30%, and it would rise correspondingly for the surrounding countries. Actually, the U.S. does the same. U.S. manufacturers send parts and components and high technology to China. They put it together. You buy it here. It's called Chinese exports. This is part of the global production system. Well, most of the world is still pretty much under control, but one place isn't, China. It's too big to push around. It's exercising sovereignty, and the U.S. is very upset about it, but can't do anything about it. China is returning to what it was for thousands of years. Center of the world, not much interested in the barbarians. What they call the century of humiliation is over. They're reconstructing from it. They're very confident. And the U.S. is pretty upset about it. We can see this in the papers, how it works right now. A couple of weeks ago, there were U.S. naval maneuvers in the seas right around China, north and south. Wasn't much covered here. China was pretty upset about it. I happened to be in China at the time. Even in the English language Chinese press, there was a lot of annoyance about it. They were particularly annoyed about plans to send an advanced nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the George Washington, into the waters not far from China's coast, where, according to the Chinese, it could attack Beijing with nuclear missiles. They weren't happy about that, and they were complaining about it. There was some commentary here, kind of like diaperology again. What's wrong with the Chinese? Why are they opposed to freedom of the seas? You can just imagine what would happen if the Chinese Navy was carrying out naval exercises in the Caribbean. You don't have to imagine. We'd have a nuclear war. But in the case of, if you look at the strategic analysis literature, this is discussed, and it's called a classic security dilemma. A security dilemma, classic security dilemma, is when you have two powers, each of which thinks that the policies it's carrying out are essential for its defense, but the other power regards them as offensive. And this is such a dilemma. The Chinese think that their waters are necessary, the waters near them are necessary for defense. We regard control of the waters near them as necessary for our defense, so it's a classic security dilemma. Well, if you think it through, that follows from the guiding principle that what we say goes. We own the world. If it happens to be the waters near China, we own them. So if they're getting in the way, they're being aggressive. We've got to do something about China's aggressiveness. This discussion is going on right now. I mean, in the journals and the press. More significant, more worrisome to the United States is China's growing economic clout. It's a huge importer of primary products, and that's of concern, especially in particular in Latin America, the backyard, which we have to control. By now, China's the biggest trading partner of Brazil, the most important economy in Latin America. That relationship is growing. It's also got a powerful stake in other primary product producers, Chile, Peru, Argentina. Much more significant is the Middle East. Remember Burley's thesis. If we can control Middle East oil, we can control the world. And conversely, if we lose control of Middle East oil, we can't control the world. Well, Saudi Arabia, which is the jewel in the crown, the U.S. is still the major investor and importer, but about half of Saudi oil exports are now going east and not west, and that proportion is growing. China is the largest importer and exporter of Middle East oil, whole Middle East, replacing the U.S. And it's growing. The Chinese trade with important, and they're also investing. Chinese trade and commercial relations with the Middle East have doubled in the past 5 years. The implications are significant, and the same is true of a quiet development, which has the U.S. concerned, the growth of what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's a China-based organization which includes Russia, Siberia with its enormous resources, includes the Central Asian states with their resources. India is an observer, Pakistan, Iran, all observers. The United States asked for observer status and was rejected. They have already, a couple of years ago, said they don't want any U.S. military bases in Central Asia. One of the leading international economists, Stephen King, describes what's happening as potentially a new energy cartel involving both producers and consumers, and some believe it may even be a counterpart to NATO. Well, meanwhile, in Latin America, the backyard, which our little region over here, for the first time in 500 years, it's been moving towards independence and integration. And the U.S. is not backing off.